Hi, Jacqueline here. I'm here to talk to you about Growing Up Chicano, which is the book that I chose. There were a lot of really great themes in this book, a lot I identify with. I'm half Mexican. And she talks about, Lopez, the author, talks about growing up, and there were no books about Mexican culture or Chicano culture, and you couldn't really learn about them in history books either. And even fairy tales and Disney movies portray mostly Caucasian princesses. And you watch these movies and read these books, and you want to dream about yourself being in the book, and they couldn't ever find anyone that looked just like them. And so the authors put this book together to kind of give an example of what life was like for them, so that they could see them for future generations, and that other people could learn about what growing up Chicano was like. And in the 1960s, they tried to do a revolution so that it would be in the history books, and they really fought for their civil rights, and so that they wouldn't be ignored as a people and as a generation. They often tried to assimilate back in the day, and before the 1960s, when they came into America, they tried to be just like everybody else and try to adapt to the American culture, as did my great-grandparents when they immigrated here from Mexico. They taught their kids English and how to dress like Americans and how to develop the cultures that the Americans celebrated. And so by the time the 1960s happened, a lot of their culture and traditions were disappearing, as was the language. So they set out to try to look for themselves and try to rediscover who they were as a culture. And that's when the Chicano movement came about, and they really identified themselves as Chicano, which before it was never called that. There's very difference in the different labels that they put upon themselves, like being Puerto Rican and Mexican. They're all very different. Latino. Chicano is a very unique cultural significance of people. This book contains 20 short stories which identified what it was like being in that culture during those times. Being in a mainstream school environment, not having people that were like you. The teacher wouldn't call on you because she thought just because you didn't speak very good English that you were poor, maybe dressed a little bit poorer, that you wouldn't know the answer. And so a lot of times they weren't called upon or given the same treatment that other kids were treated. These stories illustrate how the authors found ways to confront ethnic stereotypes, test the bonds of family, search for their identity, and cope with the rites of passage. It's very rooted in Chicano culture. Family is a very big theme in their culture as well as literature. The relationship between Chicanos and their elders is very important in the literature that Chicanos write about. The elders are the foundation of their cultures and their traditions. They try to pass down the language and the stories from generations to generations. I know growing up, my grandparents would talk to us about what life was like for them growing up and the stories that they were passed down from their elders back in their days, and what life was like for them in Mexico, so that future generations could pass down to each other. And since they were never written about in history books or written about, there were no like Mexican or Chicano authors, so they were relying on the word of mouth to spread their history and their stories, which is very important to them. The elders teach later generations the importance of respect, honor, and good manners in Chicano culture. They were very close as a family, and they really valued their family above all else. And the father was the undisputed head of the family, and the mother was mostly responsible for the maintenance of the household, which is very hard when they fought to work outside of the house and be more part of the family dynamic. And a lot of the times they weren't taken seriously and only seen as a provider of the house and a mother, and they weren't seen as being, in society, and they had to work extra hard because not only were they a minority, but they were also a woman, so it was really hard for them. Like I said, Chicano literature stems from oral as well as poetic traditions. The story in the book, Growing Up Chicano, are short stories that the authors felt portrayed what life was like for them growing up and detailed their rich history. They were often autobiographical, where the authors look to find themselves and find reflections in their own lives. They wanted to fill the bookstores and libraries so future generations may have something to look up to. One of the stories within the book, La Historia, Journeys in the Borderland, highlights life for Chicanos. It was set to tell the story of their people. They were handed down from generations, the stories, and helped shape them as a people. The Ruins is about the legend of Aslan, if I'm saying that right. And it was a promised land where there are no racial injustices, poverty, and everybody stayed young. And the author details a time where she heard about her grandfather's ranch in Mexico, and it was a mini legend for their family. She had very strong ties with her family, visited her grandma, who did not speak any English, every Sunday. I related a lot to the story by Rosa Elena. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Musgardo. And she remembered sitting in her mother's kitchen, in her grandmother's kitchen, and all the grandmothers would be making homemade tortillas, and that made me feel related to my grandma. And we would always sit in her kitchen, and she would cook for us and tell us stories about her growing up. And she would go, mija, let me cook for you. You look hungry, like you're too skinny. And she would make us like a smorgasbord of all these foods, like especially for breakfast. I remember she would make us like pancakes and waffles and eggs and sausages. And I'd be like, Grandma, no, I'm like really full. And she'd be like, no, mija, you need to eat. And that was like her way of showing her love for us. And I'll never forget all those times we laughed in her kitchen and we cried because we were laughing so hard. And one time we were at the mall and we almost got locked in. So that was always like really funny for us. And when my grandma moved in with us, she would always try to give me money. And like I would sit and talk with her because I knew that these were the last moments I would have for her. So reading this book reminded me a lot of my grandmother and what it must have been like for them growing up as Chicano people, and how hard my grandma must have had to fight to work outside of the home, because she did work, and my grandpa had an accident at work, so he was at home. And so my grandma worked really hard, and it makes me really proud for my culture and how hard they worked to not just be seen, labeled as, oh, they're Mexicans, they can't do anything, they can't reach anything. And I know that each generation works harder to provide for their children, just like my grandparents did. And they didn't have much of an education. My parents made it to around college. They never really graduated, but my aunt's about to get her doctorate degree, and here I am getting my bachelor's. And I think it's really exciting to know that the women in my history, in my Chicano history, they fought so hard so that they didn't have any future for themselves seen or laid out for them. They could only be homemakers. And they worked really hard, as the stories that were told in this, to be seen more than just a woman or more than just a Chicano or a Latino, but they worked to see themselves as individuals. And this book, you could see that they worked really hard to find themselves and their culture, and they didn't know how to portray themselves, but these books like really capture the essence of what it was like being in their culture, the rich foods and the dancing and the music. And I really identified with them. And growing up, I was half Mexican, half white, so I feel like I missed out on a lot of my Mexican culture. But this book was really exciting for me to read because I got to catch up on a lot of what I feel like I missed growing up. My Aunt Mary shares a lot of our culture and our history, and she really, this book really tries to keep the history alive, as does my aunt and my great aunt. And now it's up to me to tell the stories of my people, so that my children can know how hard it was for my great-grandparents. They came on the train, they traveled through Mexico and got taken by military there, and they're questioned and like, who are you? What are you doing here? And they were let go. Luckily, they were able to pass off as being belonging to that area, and so they were able to come over here. And I have a renewed appreciation for my culture, and after reading this book, I wish my grandparents were around so I can ask them about their point of view of the stories from this book. Next time I see my Aunt Mary, I'll definitely ask what life like was for her growing up. These books are only a small window into the lives of, the culture, and my great aunt would have a lot to say also. She has the best stories. I always love hearing her. I didn't really look Mexican growing up. I looked mostly white, but these people, they really had to fight hard to be seen. So I really liked reading more about the culture, like I said, that I missed. Have a good day. Bye. Ugh.